Hello, good evening, guten Abend und willkommen. Hello and welcome here at the Goethe Institute. My name is Jörg Schumacher and it's a pleasure to see you here at 30 Irving Place and on Zoom for an event with Cuny tonight. I'm very happy to have people in this room back again. And to have this event together with the Cuny School of Journalism and the Cuny School of Law. We're at the Goethe Institute, we're the German Cultural Center. We host a variety of events, organize events ourselves. One, you'll find this already saw at the reception. There's a new audio guide about Hannah Arendt's New York City, which you can download as an app and walk through the Upper West Side and other places of New York City. We also do have theater activities and a library, as you see on the right side of this very room, which is open 5 days a week and open to the public free of charge. And of course, as a Goethe Institute, we also do German language courses. So if there's anybody here in the room who wants to brush up their German, or take a first course, this would be the right place. And the good news is new courses start next week. So if you want to start quickly, that would be great. For today, I have the duty is to inform you about our COVID policy. Thanks for registering. Thanks for keeping your masks on during the event. So the procedure is the panelists can take their masks off, and we ask the audience to keep their masks on. After the event, there will be a wine reception. To your right. And then it's up to everybody who would like to stay to keep masks on or off. But for the core part of the discussion we ask you to keep the mask on. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Masi from Cuny Zurensen Center. We're very happy to have you all here. She will introduce the speakers and the panelists, and I thank you very much for coming and your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Jörg. This is a beautiful space, the Goethe Institute. Thank you for hosting us here. We already have our Sorensen Center banner up. I'm hoping this can be our satellite office, if that suits you. Welcome all of you. It is wonderful to be here in person. I'm Masi, founding executive director of the Sorensen Center for International Peace at Cuny School of Law, which is located on ancestral Lenape land, and we are also on that land here. So wanted to mention that as we feel it's important as an educational institution to learn about that history and to be respectful and do what we can to mitigate the harms that were done and to recognize how precious the land is to Indigenous peoples before and currently. This is our first in-person event in 2 years. And you are making us so happy that you came out to be here and share it with us. The last event that we had was in March 2020 with Wolfgang Kaleck. And we then had to, when the pandemic started, he went back to Europe, back to ECCHR, where he stayed very busy. He was working on the Koblenz trial, which we'll talk about this evening. And he also wrote a book. He wrote a book, The Complete Utopia of Human Rights. And this is after a previous book, Law versus Power, which I highly recommend. We're in the library, so I thought I would pull a couple of books to show. Wolfgang was really able to take us on a journey through the work he's done as a human rights lawyer. And we're joined tonight by Alia Malek, who also took us on a journey through her article she pitched for the New York Times, and it was published on January 25th. We shared it with you all, and I strongly encourage you to read it, as well as her book, The Home That Was Our Country, which was published last year, a memoir about Syria, which I'm reading now. It's excellent. And in this article, Malia does what the Sorensen Center does and what Cuny School of Law does, is she kept the article client-centered. And so tonight we are thrilled to be joined by Ruham Hawash, who is a plaintiff, a survivor, from a horrible detention facility and is now the co-director or the founder and co-director of Impact, which is civil society research and development based in Berlin. So we'll get to hear about her pro-democracy efforts and her role in the trial. With that, now we'll begin our conversation with a journalist lawyer, actually, both, and a human rights lawyer and a plaintiff. And we look forward to having Wolfgang set the stage, and then we'll have Q&A following. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Camille and Jörg and both of your teams to setting up this event today. And I'm happy to discuss with Ruham. At some point she will appear on the screen from Berlin, and with Alia. And actually we have the ambition to discuss two things. One is accountability for crimes against humanity. And the second is what brought the German justice to judge about Syrian crimes committed in Syria against Syrians. So it's basically two stories. And to understand the story, you have to learn a little bit about universal jurisdiction in Europe. A story which began basically in 1998 when Augusto Pinochet, October 1998, when Augusto Pinochet, the former Chilean dictator, got arrested in London due to an arrest warrant of a Spanish judge on behalf of Chilean victims of the Chilean dictatorships in the 70s. So that was a moment thrilling for all NGOs and for all lawyers, because before that, before 1998, international criminal justice was an affair for the states. The Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt. It was always the states who organized these trials, and survivors, witnesses, and civil society actors had not much of a role to play. But that changed from 1998 on, from the Pinochet arrest on. And the story of universal jurisdiction is an up and down, because same with the International Criminal Court, which was also established in 2002. Everybody had big expectations that now everybody who commits crimes against humanity and war crimes lands on the bench, which didn't happen because many of those who are powerful actors who committed such crimes were never ever challenged with even investigations. And I can tell you this story because it's the story of my organization, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, based in Berlin. So we tried to bring cases against Donald Rumsfeld and his lawyers because of the torture in Abu Ghraib and in Guantanamo. We are suing corporate actors, international corporations who are involved in all kinds of crimes, aiding and abetting dictators and authoritarian regimes by, for example, exporting arms. And so it's an up and down, but the recent decade, we saw a very active federal prosecutor's office in Germany starting an investigation into Syria. And the reason why they could look into Syria was that the German law on universal jurisdiction is quite progressive and open towards international law. They had a special investigation unit, and we come back to that. We have a big Syrian exile community in Germany of nearly 1 million persons who made it to Germany. And so maybe you want to say some words, Alia, about what happened in Syria after the Arab Spring began, and what brought the Syrians to Germany, and what brought the federal prosecutor to investigate the Syrian crimes. And at some point, I would like to see Ruham to be with us. She should be there. Mark, is it possible? It's midnight in Berlin, so we appreciate very much. No, that's us.
That's my nightmare. At least it looked like I was paying attention. Well, shall I? Can she hear us at least? Okay. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you and to be here in person. Thank you to the Goethe Institute and to the wonderful City University of New York. I teach at the School of Journalism. I see some of my students here, some former students here. So it's a huge task is to try to get you up to speed on everything Syrian. But I will give you as much, give you the information that I think you need. But what I'd like to know first is how many people here who's been to Syria? Okay, good. And how many of you, including the ones who've been to Syria, have heard of the Mukhabarat or know what the Mukhabarat are? Okay. And for those of you who don't, how many of you know who the Stasi are? Let's bring it back to Germany. Okay. So, yeah. I guess they're funny, but I am going to tell a joke since we're about it to sort of to help us sort of like understand what we're talking about. And the reason I want to tell you a little bit about the Mukhabarat in Syria is not only were they central to this trial, because the two men who were tried in Germany are former Mukhabarat agents who came to Germany as refugees and asked for asylum, and in part obviously thought that in coming in defecting from the regime and coming to Germany and becoming refugees themselves would somehow kind of cleanse them of their past or erase their past. But the other reason I want to tell you just a little bit about the Mukhabarat, of all the things I could tell you about Syria, is that it's so central to what the experience was like to be a Syrian. And the fact is it defined generations of Syrians. Hi, Ruham. She can hear us. So the Assad regime, which is currently in power and headed by Bashar al-Assad, actually came to power in 1970. So by the time the Arab Spring started, we were 40 years into the Assad regime. But before Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, regimes changed every few years in Syria. Since Syria got independence in the post-war period, there had been, Syrians, as I write, have become so used to the coup, the counter coup, and the attempted coup, that it had a kind of rhythm. But then in 1970, when Hafez al-Assad came to power, his regime stuck. And one of the reasons his regime stuck was because he increased the use of the Mukhabarat, which are sort of like surveillance bodies. So whereas in other cities here in New York, you can feel anonymous, there is no anonymity in places like Syria. Your every move is being watched and being reported on. What seems significant, even what doesn't seem significant. And whereas the Stasi sort of had a reputation for being precise. I'm sure there's like a 20-letter German word that sums up Stasi precision of some. Okay, well, oh, there you go. And what does that mean? And that means how? State security service. Yes. Okay. But that sort of precision that the German Stasi had is not what the Syrians had. They did not, the Syrian Mukhabarat really didn't operate with precision, operated much more with incredible brutality and violence. And if I may just tell a joke that sort of summarizes this, and there's like a whole body of jokes about the Mukhabarat, because it became one of the only ways that Syrians could kind of talk about the violence that they were living daily. And the joke goes something like this. The sort of secret police agencies of a few different countries are brought to this elite training site. It's a wooded forest, a wooded territory. So the CIA is there, the KGB/Stasi are there, and the Syrian Mukhabarat are there, and the Israeli Mossad, and they're all tasked with going in and retrieving a fox. And so the CIA and the KGB and the Syrian telling achieve this task in like an hour. The Mossad and the Syrian telling do it even faster. But the Syrian Mukhabarat take a solid 4 hours, right? And by the time they come out, they do not have a fox. Instead, what they have with them is a severely beaten, severely brutalized rabbit. And the other agents are sort of skeptical. They don't know whether to laugh or what's going on. And they say, but that's not a fox. And the Syrians are completely unfazed. They're like, well, he confessed, right? And that's sort of like what we were living with in Syria. And that is really, I think people fail to fundamentally understand that it was, 4 decades of that kind of daily violence in people's lives, of people being disappeared, of people going into a security apparatus and never coming out. There's still so many tens of thousands of people who are unaccounted for from the 70s. And today I think the number of unaccounted for are over 100,000. That finally, when the Arab Spring did sort of seem to come to the region, there was a spontaneous uprising and sort of, movement asking for reforms. And it wasn't even asking for the fall of the regime in Syria's case, but what had sort of infiltrated Syrian society was a kind of violence, political violence, and also sort of economic violence around this cronyism and corruption. And the fact that an individual Syrian meant nothing, right? What meant everything was the regime and its power, and all the rest of us were just sort of bit players in that control. And in 2011, there was a spontaneous, not even spontaneous, because civil society, even as it had been sort of disbanded and suppressed in Syria, came forward asking, along with people who were not necessarily civil society activists, asking for reforms, for an end to the corruption, to an end to the cronyism. And the regime answered with violence, with the kind of violence that you can see on your televisions, but also the kind of violence that just sort of takes people and disappears you and never to be heard from again. And so in 2015, and we can talk about all the other things that happened, but you probably most famously know about ISIS, but ISIS comes about not until 2014. So Syria really goes from what was really a beautiful revolution in many ways. It devolves into a brutal civil war and proxy war with many other players participating, whether it's Iran and Russia on the one side or Gulf countries and the United States on other sides. We've lost Ruham. We can hear her. Okay. So people like, and Ruham was active in this, and she can talk about it in her personal experience. Yeah. And people, in 2015, there was a mass exodus of Syrians. Syrians were displaced throughout, began to be displaced very early on, but in 2015 was this mass exodus across the Mediterranean Sea. And I made that journey with Syrian refugees, and their primary desired destination was Germany. And that's sort of the beginning of how these two countries' fates come together and culminate in this case. So do we have Ruham?
Do we have Ruham? Yeah, so we wait until you have figured that out. What Alia was just talking about is, in fact, notorious torture, which amounts to crimes against humanity. And so that triggers the principle of universal jurisdiction in Germany and in other states of Europe. And the two driving factors for one of the most comprehensive investigations into state crimes in the recent history in Germany was, first, the federal prosecutor's office themselves took up cases of crimes against humanity in Syria and elsewhere, but they were focusing very much on terrorism accusations. So those returners from ISIS and from other groups. Do you hear us, Ruham?
Yes, okay. I hear you.
Yeah, so the federal prosecutor focused at the beginning very much on procedures against single men who were involved in crimes of ISIS and others. But they also had a look into the crimes of especially the torture into the Assad regime. And the second driving factor was, in fact, as Alia pointed out, the exile community in Germany with Ruham and many others, lawyers, journalists who made it to Berlin, networks of the opposition who provided organizations like ours with information. And so at some point, we sat together with a number of exiled Syrians and strategized what would be the best take. And we came to the conclusion that we wanted to focus on torture because we have so many people who can tell about torture, witnesses, survivors, and experts. And one of them is Ruham. So Ruham, finally, we have you here on the screen. Could you Tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of an insight in your own story. What brought you to the democracy movement in Syria, and how did you finally come to Germany? Before then, we start to talk about the proceeding in Koblenz and elsewhere.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I have been hearing you all along, but I was not allowed to open my mic. This is why I couldn't participate before that. But now I am with you and happy to be able to participate. So I will tell shortly, and I will be also ready for answering any questions from your side or also from the audience side. I am one of the hundreds of thousands that Alia has mentioned that demonstrated in 2011 against the Syrian regime and the Assad dictatorship. I have joined the peaceful uprising in 2011 after I have met a professor who I was working with back in Damascus in the Ministry of Higher Education. I met this person. This person was telling me how his family is besieged in Dar'a and he cannot access them and he cannot reach them out, and he doesn't know if his family children have milk today or not, and he was crying at my office. This is when the Palestinian Syrian have decided to join the Syrian revolution that we called at that day the Dignity Revolution, because the basic demands people were asking for when they went out to the streets was dignity, freedom before democracy, and also democracy, of course. But it started about the dignity, and the regime has tried with all means to suppress this peaceful uprising. The regime has targeted the peaceful activists, followed them in every corner in the city, and also arrested many of activists and released many of criminals instead. So the Syrian, let's say the Syrian uprising dynamo, the Syrian activists in the big cities in Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, were the first people attacked and arrested. And at some point I was also myself arrested at a checkpoint in near Damascus and landed in Al Khatib branch. And this is where my story has begun to change. These were the last months I've spent in Damascus. I have left the prison after I was arrested in March 2012, and I have left the prison in summer that year and eventually had to leave Syria with one way travel permission. And this was also a typical story for any activist that has also left the Syrian prisons alive. So I am one of these lucky people who has survived this branch and made it out to Germany in December 2012. I arrived to Germany. At that day, I arrived as a refugee. I did not have really big plans to take a part in such a trial, but like the efforts that have been made to make this trial real, to make this trial happen, has pushed me to participate in it. But but when I was in Syria, when I was arrested, and after I was released, I have never thought about this. I have never imagined that at some day I will be standing in Germany suing these people who have arrested me one day. So yeah, so it has been an amazing journey it's also
we come back to that, especially to the one moment, Ruham, where we all sat in the courtroom and you sit just 2 meters away from the Colonel Anwar Raslan, who was arrested in Germany, as he came to Germany as he decided at some point to leave the regime for personal reasons, and called himself a defector, and turned himself over to German authorities. And he thought, because he decided to be part of the so-called opposition, he would never be tried for the crimes he committed in the Al-Khatib branch of an infamous prison branch, torture prison branch in Damascus, where Ruham and others had been tortured. But before we come to the Al-Khatib trial in the German province court of Koblenz, and which Alia covered in a New York Times magazine article, I want to tell you just a little bit of an entry, because the interesting thing is these were investigations which were directed in the very beginning in 2011, 2012 against nobody. So they were called structural investigations. So the prosecutor decided to look into the Syrian situation, into the Syrian crimes against humanity. And then whenever somebody would show up in Germany or elsewhere, where Germany could arrest them on behalf of a European or international arrest warrants, the German justice system would be prepared to put this person on trial. And so we as an organization, ECCHR in Berlin, together with our Syrian partners, decided that we want to go against the highest responsible for torture. So we filed several complaints together with Ruham and others, based on the witness testimonies, but also based on expert opinions. We targeted the directors of the different secret services, and we were successful because one arrest warrant was released in 2018 against Jamil Hassan, who's directing the Air Force Secret Service, also very notorious torture secret service. And on the other hand, so that was the highest level. And on the other hand, we try to be prepared if a person not too low, not of a too low rank enters Germany, and then we would be ready to file complaints against him. And this person was, as I said, Anwar Raslan. And so in the midst of the COVID crisis and the lockdown in Germany, the trial started in April 2020, and Alia covered it. And so maybe you give us some of your impressions of that trial, because you observed it for quite a while.
Yeah, hi Ruham, and feel free to interrupt if there's anything, if you want to interrupt, basically. Well, I think, okay, for an American audience, it's probably some things here that I should just sort of explain. In Germany, which has universal jurisdiction, right? Which means it's, not only are they party to the Rome Statute, they've made it part of their domestic criminal law as well, right? It's the idea that you can pursue these crimes against humanity or these war crimes, no matter where they took place, because the idea is that we are all diminished by them, right? And so they have a war crimes unit. And initially, when 2011 started with the Arab Spring, because I interviewed them extensively, they did start these structural investigations just generally into who perpetrators may or may not be and what was going on. But when almost 1 million Syrians showed up in 2015, their calculations very much changed, because they had access all of a sudden to, potentially, victims, witnesses, and of course, perpetrators, right? So if out of 800,000, even if just 5% of them are perpetrators, that's still, 5% of 800,000 is like still 40,000. Yeah, 40,000 people, right? I mean, that's a lot, that's a huge number. And I mean, in theory, right? In theory. Yeah. And, just to pick up on something that Wolfgang said before Ruham joined us, obviously, it is ISIS is much sexier. It terrorizes people who don't know about the mukhabarat and don't know about that kind of invisible violence much, much more. And so, yes, there's a lot more pursuit of ISIS, even though, much more of the violence and the death and the destruction has been perpetrated by the regime and its allies. And I have no problem saying this, and it passed New York Times fact-checking muster because it was such an easy fact to prove. Okay, so even though I know a bearded person chopping off heads somehow terrorizes us much more, the major part of the violence was perpetrated by the regime, and also that kind of extremist, sort of let's call it jihadist violence was perpetrated to the not delight, but to the advantage of the regime. And we can't get into this now, but the regime definitely worked very hard by arresting people like Ruham and taking that sort of, secular, peaceful opposition off the street, at the same time emptying its prisons of the kind of criminals who they were much more confident would take up arms, right? Because in the moral murkiness of a civilian uprising against a military, the regime was not going to be able to sort of win affection for long. But when they start saying that we're going up against a jihadist threat, and knowing sort of the post 9/11 mind and the post 9/11 ready-made discourse on the war on terror, it was much easier for those for people to sort of focus on that kind of violence. And that was initially also under the criminal law, German criminal law. It's much easier to do that because a lot of those were returning Europeans who had come to Syria to find fame, fortune, or paradise, whatever. But these kinds of cases, which would have been much harder for them, became much easier for them because they had all these Syrians in Germany, and because ECCHR was already serving as this incredible bridge. Because in Germany, you can file a complaint as a civilian body, and then the German federal prosecutor can sort of look into that complaint. And that is the case that Ruham eventually joined and became a plaintiff. So my observations, I don't know if anybody really is interested in my observations, but it was stunning, and some of the things that I kept coming back to, and I think are particularly relevant thematically here, is that the same way like Ruham said, and I don't want to speak for Ruham, but this is what she told me, and she can explain it further. She wasn't thinking in part about bringing anybody to trial because she got out alive. Right, so many people died, and we should say that torture sort of became a mode of execution. People were tortured to death in Syria in very, very high numbers. So for the people who got out, it was sort of like, well, what more do I want? I got out alive, and there's so many that didn't. And that goes back to the idea of how you're sort of robbed of that individuality when there's that kind of daily political violence being enacted on you. At the same time that I think the people who've defected from the regime thought, well, I'm just an individual. The regime still stands. I've defected from that apparatus. So why would I be held accountable for my specific actions? But sitting in that courtroom, I heard a lot of witness testimony from individuals who had really withstood, really unspeakable things. And there was, I did see the kind of catharsis for some of them in being able to name and accuse and hold somebody accountable. I also felt a lot of the inutility, right? Because the regime still stands, and these are but two people. One, Anwar Hassan, the colonel's higher ranking, but the other guy was much lower ranking. It doesn't mean he doesn't have blood on his hands, but it was like, I felt a kind of conversion though, by the end of it, of sort of understanding that individuals are entitled though to seek that kind of something. Is it justice? I don't know, but that to be able to confront those who did this to you.
Yeah,
and
you touched upon a very important question, which has been discussed in Germany actually since the Newmark trials, in the first trials against Nazi perpetrators. By the way, there weren't so many trials against Nazi perpetrators orchestrated by the German justice. And that is the question, what can criminal justice achieve in the light of such an egregious crime like crimes against humanity? Because it's the state apparatus who was behind these crimes, but obviously also consisting of individuals. And so in the court, it's only the individual standing on trial, but behind that, it was the apparatus.
Yeah, and I think it's in Nuremberg. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something that, you know, regimes are not made up. I mean, regimes are made up of individuals. And I think that's sort of something I think about today as I watch what's going on in Ukraine and in other parts of the world, that yes, there is this sort of like big amorphous evil supposedly, but like it takes individuals to make it. And at the same time, I should just say, specific to the Syrian psyche, and this is something I also thought about a lot all of July, so just like testimony after testimony, is that, and this is something when I was researching my book, I looked a lot at, you know, South Africa, at Argentina, at other places that have had the same kind of political violence. And Brittenbach, the South African poet, he had a line about you know, the people who live in dictatorship or in these kinds of regimes, that you are, you know, you're of course a victim on a daily basis, but you also become kind of a collaborator, right? Because I mean, and that's what I felt as a Syrian. And I had a lot of conversations with witnesses afterwards and who were testified then. It's like, it is kind of a profound, it's not shame, but like, because I don't know, you know, you would have disappeared. Like what good would your protest have done? But that, you know, for something that lasts for 40 years and then 50 years, and of course there are all kinds of superpowers behind it. But, you know, how do we, you know, yeah, you are on some level complicit if you go about your life. I mean, I went about my life in Damascus. I walked by El Khati because that was in the neighborhood where my gym was and where my grandmother's house was. I walked by it every day. I would see the days that the bus had arrived, and I knew people had been discharged. And I knew people were being held in that dungeon, you know, across the street from popular restaurants and other shops.
Can we see Ruham again? I don't know why she's blended out.
She can hear us, but we have difficulties putting the video up.
Yeah. Can she talk? Okay, so Ruham, Alia was describing, you know, also like you escaping, and you had not at all in mind that you would at some point have your own, let's say, day in court. Actually, you had 2 days in court. One was in summer 21 and the other was in December 21. And so in the summer, you had to testify as a witness, which is a very difficult role because you're submitted to certain rules, your questions by the court and eventually by the defense lawyers. And in December 2001, actually you hold a political speech, a personal political speech in court as a civil party claimant. Maybe you describe us a little bit about your two different encounters with the court. We still don't see you.
And also how you felt on the day that the verdict was delivered.
Whatever. Yeah. So meanwhile, we entertain you. No, it's a bit disturbing, but and so the trial actually lasted more or less 2 years. It started in March 2020 and it ended with a verdict in January 13th of this year, 2022. And as Alia said, we had a lot of witnesses. We had a lot of discussion about the trial.
There's a lot of criticism.
And not, I would say, less than I expected. There was one small thing you said, you know, the 5% of the 800 or 1 million people you consider as perpetrator. Could be. I mean, that's a very difficult thing. And we were very cautious to spell that out because we had this summer of migration in 2015 and there was a kind of welcoming of the refugees. But at some point, some journalists started to say also a lot of criminals have come to Germany, ordinary criminals, like people who would rape German women, they say, and also criminals from the Syrian regime. And so they tried to make up, stories of eventual potential perpetrators who came with the refugees. And so we were completely, our organization, we were declining to give them these journalist interviews because it was very clear they wanted to use it as an argument against migration.
But this is the federal prosecutor. They spoke about that. Yeah.
But they were also very cautious because
it's not an endorsement of that.
They got a lot of false accusations. So are we ready? No.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, not see you. So
it's like the voice of God.
Let us a little bit participate into your impressions of the 2 days in court you had.
Yes, I've been hearing you, so no worries. In regards to the 2 days, actually, these 2 days were completely different than each other. As you have mentioned, Wolfgang, the first day I had to come in and tell my whole story and answer questions, detail the questions. I had to dig out some painful memories that I have always tried to keep away and behind. And the second day, I arrived to the court with totally different energy, and I had the space to express my demands to the court, to ask the court what I have been waiting from this court to, and also I took the chance to send some demands to the German government and the world governments in general. So the 2 days were totally different, but both days were very essential for me individually to develop that concept of justice, because before this trial I did not myself experience justice. Like suing somebody from the Mukha Barat is something as good as fiction, and this is something that you don't think about during your life. So when I heard that I will be participating in such a trial, I didn't know actually what to wait from this trial and what is this trial about. So both days have equally contributed to develop this concept of justice, and yeah, both of them were as well essential for me to understand what I want from this trial. And in regards to the verdict day, the verdict day was like the closure of the whole story. It has changed my detention story. Before that day, I have always told the people that I was arrested in Al-Khatib branch, that I was tortured, that they took my civil rights, that they took my ID card, etc. So the whole story was a sad story that have never ended, because until today I didn't receive my ID back. And on the day of the verdict, I had got a new end for my story, that after leaving Syria, I could participate and help in suing these people and bringing the persons who were responsible for arresting me and torturing me to the court. So this is what this whole trial has changed in my life. the experience, actually, to be honest, the experience to stand there in front of a court and tell the judge about your story. I didn't, before doing that, I didn't know how would that contribute to my feelings of justice. And I still remember that day in 2016 when I was in the living room in my house in Hamburg with my ex-girlfriend. I was sitting and watching the Tunisian national TV. And there were people that were standing in front of a court, and these people were telling these stories, their stories to the court that day. And this whole session was published, was streamed publicly on the TV, on the national TV. And then at that day, I have asked myself, like, how could this mean justice, that people stand in front of the public and tell their stories? But I didn't understand that until I stood myself in front of the German judge and told her my story. At that day, when the German judge nodded in her head like this, and after hearing my story, I felt like at that moment that this person understands what I am trying to say here, and that this person can actually do something with this story that I am telling her. So this is when I finally understood what does it mean to stay in a court and tell your story.
Yeah, and then you explained it in your closing speech. You were sitting just next to the former Colonel Anwar Ruslan, and that was actually a moment. I'm a routine lawyer, so I have seen many scenes in court, but actually that was one of the moments. And I'm not a strong believer into criminal justice, especially not ordinary criminal justice in the prison system, I have to say. But that was one of the moments where I think criminal justice in this context can deliver something. When you saw the defendant, Anwar Ruslan, listening to Ruham, who was telling her story, and there was this moment. He was very ordered. He was a very, structured man. He kind of he continued his career as an interrogation officer in the German courtroom. So he was taking notes during the whole trial, and he was exchanging with his lawyers as he was their colleagues. So he came into the courtroom and greeted everybody as like daily. That was his daily routine. But when Ruham and the two other women spoke, he was completely puzzled. He was confused. He didn't know what to do. And then that was the moment when I had to say I was once again convinced. And I saw similar scenes in the Argentinian dictatorship trials, when I was convinced that this bringing together in the courtroom drama is actually something that can not only deliver a catharsis to the persons who are involved there, but if well translated into the public outside of the courtroom, it can also serve for a collective coming to terms and for a collective catharsis. And that's also something Ruham and the others were, on one hand, telling their personal experience, but on the other hand, they were also considering them as part of a much broader collective. And so one of the translators of what happened in court, there was you, Alia, and finally resulting in your big article. So what do you think? What role does journalism or reporting or whatever writing about this kind of trials? What role can it play? What is your role in such a trial? And is it part of the whole, let's say, catharsis, coming to terms with such crimes?
Well, I mean, the role of, I think journalism is paramount. And I think we're seeing, unfortunately, we see much more about the failures of journalism, I would say, than the successes of journalism. I mean, obviously, everyone is paying, or it does feel, for example, the world seems to be paying a lot of attention to what is happening in Ukraine, and rightly so. But it's impossible to not, the self, the id, whatever. Like there's a constant like comparison to how Syria was portrayed, how Syria was understood, and obviously, I think that the ability for us to empathize much more with the Ukrainians is in many ways a failure of the journalism that was surrounding the Syrians. Now, that's in part because, as you can see, as Putin tries to use this Nazi rhetoric to delegitimize or dehumanize the Ukrainians, it's much less effective than the language that had been used to dehumanize the Syrians, because this idea that everybody is a terrorist, I mean, and that Islam and Arab culture are like pathologized as inherently violent. This didn't just start 3 weeks ago, the way it seems like the Ukraine, this like Nazis in Ukraine discourse started. But the war on, the post 9/11 discourse starts really in 2001, but it also did come from nowhere. It has its precedents that, think to the Iran hostage crisis, think back. We can talk about that some other day. So, that language was ready made, that dehumanization was already there. And of course, journalists weren't singular in playing that role, but they were a big part of it. So, what role can journalism play in writing about this article? This article, to me, it's not just about Syria. I mean, I've been really, if you, I hope some of the feeling that you get after the article is like that there's something unsatisfactory, that there's something left undone. And it's not just what's happening in Syria and the insane impunity that the regime is continuing to enjoy. But like what I would hope this article could have done, and not just introducing you to wonderful people like Wolfgang and Ruham, and also the criticisms of it, but helping us think through, because what is our plan going forward as a world? Not to, we said global, local, and beyond, right? Well, this is the beyond part. This impunity is on the rise, not just in the Middle East, everywhere. Okay, we had these principles come out of Nuremberg, out of what happened in World War II. But what exactly is the plan going forward? Is it, I haven't finished your book yet, Wolfgang, but it's called Power versus Law. And I just, law versus power. Sorry, law versus power. But that is the question I'm thinking about constantly and all the time. And that's what I would hope the article would do in that case.
It is an incredible, important question. And Camille, whenever you come up with questions, we're happy to deal with them. The thing is, we should talk a little bit about the politics of international criminal justice, because actually, when the judgment in Germany in January came out, most of the public opinion in Germany embraced the judgment. There were even some smart commentaries saying that this law should be applied also against the powerful actors. And some of them would even mention our cases against Donald Rumsfeld and the torturers of this country, which went away without anyhow being investigated or put on trial. And that brings me to the sad also moment now with Ukraine, because our organization, we left no doubt that Putin is a war criminal, but not only because he went on a war of aggression, but also he's now committing, as there is a lot of evidence that he's committing war crimes, or he lets commit war crimes against the civilian population. But on the other hand, it leaves a very bitter taste that the same nations who were responsible for the erosion of international law, that's the US and that's the UK, actually are now the driving forces in the demand for a special tribunal for aggression. I mean, how can you demand a special tribunal for aggression when you invaded a country without any legal legitimation in 2003, Iraq, and a war which led to 1 million deaths, and people in the Western world keeps quiet? the rest of the world outside of Europe and North America obviously is aware of that. And how can you, and that's then the UK, go to the International Criminal Court, while 1 or 2 years ago, they defended themselves. They would say that the International Criminal Court shouldn't deal with their own torture in Iraq. So it's again a very frivolous instrumentalization of international criminal law, which will on the long run definitely harm international criminal justice, because this will be only universal. You can call it only universal if it's applied in an equal and universal manner. So we are an organization like mine, we are in the dilemma that we at the same time, we are obviously dealing with crimes like in Syria. We're also now in contact with Ukrainians, and we bring these cases because they should be brought to international institutions. But on the other hand, we have to criticize those powers like the UK and the US who helped to erode law and to harm the institutions. So that's a whole issue, but I think you have some questions.
Yes, we are going to turn to questions, both in the room and virtually. And I have one to start. And first of all, just what amazing stories of perseverance and courage, and a special thanks to Ruham for sticking with us at this late hour, and the heroic efforts of Mark in the back to try to work on the technical difficulties. Okay, so, well, this case was groundbreaking for many reasons. And one reason was the sexual and gender-based crimes, the prosecution and the verdict as crimes against humanity. And this question comes from Hannah, a 3L and a Sorensen Center fellow at Cuny Law School. Hannah asks, how do you see the verdict on sexual violence impacting survivors of sexual violence and other conflicts in this decision to take legal action?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. It's an incredibly important question because in this broader picture, Alia was describing rising impunity. There is a devastating segment of crimes, and that's all sexualized and gender-based violence. So even if there are trials ongoing, the part of sexualized and gender-based violence is mainly spared out. And even in the Koblenz trials, and it was not included in the initial indictment of the federal prosecutor. And that was then due to our networks and to us who finally demanded, and successfully that is it was added to the indictment later in the trial, and it's now included also in the verdict. And obviously we hope that this is also giving the prosecutor more courage to investigate and prosecute these trials, this kind of crimes, because as we all know, there is basically no war without sexualized and gender-based violence. But normally they go impune because prosecutors don't dare to prosecute them. And so in this regard, we think it's a milestone, but definitely more has to come.
Great. Let's turn to a question in the room. Would you like to?
Is there a sense of what's behind the choice of the federal prosecutors to choose to go after Syrian criminals besides numbers? You know, how far back can this law go? Can they go after Rwanda? Can they do, Cambodia, surviving Nazis?
I mean, there are Nazi trials ongoing against 90, 95, 96, 97-year-old ladies and gentlemen. These are the very last who are still alive. Most of them played a very, very minor role. And we have to say the story of the Nazi trials in Germany is basically a story of impunity, because you also, the same USA who set up the whole concept of the Nuremberg trials, Robert Jackson and Telford Taylor, Benjamin Ferencz, these super smart people wanted to create something for the whole world and not for the Nazi, not only for Nazis, but at some point they didn't play the most important role. It was then the beginning of the Cold War, and the US wanted to build up Germany as a bastion against communism. And so the Nazi elites became the elites of West Germany, of anti-communist West Germany. And so those who are rest now have only played minor roles. There are some trials against Rwandese, against Bosnians, and so it is possible, and that's exactly where our critique begins. We're saying, if this kind of jurisdiction is only targeting persons from defeated countries or from African countries, something is going wrong. That is not to say that these people shouldn't end up in trial, but there should be more. But that is a struggle where we would like all of you to get involved, and that is not something like a fight in a circus, where lawyers from one side are fighting lawyers from the other side. The public has to get involved, and the public has to be convinced. That's then our task, that this kind of trial really can make a difference. Although criminal justice always comes too late and always is incomplete in the light of such crimes. Yeah.
Well, it's also just there's a bit of it's like a prosecutorial philosophy, the idea of no safe haven versus global enforcer, right? So, given that there are all these Syrians on German territory, that, it's the idea that Germany will not become a safe haven, or will not become a place where victims who are resident on the territory don't have their chance at some kind of justice. Germany, the federal prosecutors, as Wolfgang mentioned, the arrest warrants that were issued against the top levels of the Syrian regime, those are very powerful, but they also, it can all, like the no safe haven is an easier win, right? Because as we know, one of the men that we assume had an arrest warrant against him by the Germans, has now flown to Italy twice to cooperate with the Italians on, because, again, it's because even the Assad regime has been very effective at weaponizing that war on terror discourse, right? They say that they're the ones that will be the stalwarts to protect Europe against, jihadists. So, right, it's that, also you don't want it to become meaningless. I think the prosecutors are probably also weighing that as well, like a win versus having all these arrest warrants while these guys fly around on private jets. And
Yeah, like either Rumsfeld and Bush aren't hanging out in Germany. You don't have millions of American war criminals. So
the idea is that the American, you use universal jurisdiction when the local tribunals or the national tribunals can't. So the idea, I think, in rejecting your complaints against Rumsfeld was that the Americans.
We have to say one thing, and that's a very important observation. Neither Donald Rumsfeld nor George W. Bush nor one of the lawyers would have entered Germany after 2006, after we filed the complaints. And the CIA sent out a warning to 500 of their agents involved in the CIA Extraordinary Rendition program not to travel to those countries who have this kind of provisions. You can say, I'm not happy about it. This is not justice. It's not the kind of vision I have in mind. I have more in mind. But it's more than nothing, and I think that's important to understand. That in the range between doing nothing, between passive and silent, and what is then the broader vision, it's a broad range, and it's our decision how far we can come, how we can go along this way, and that's very important to understand. Thank you. So,
hi, thank you for all joining us. My name is Nardine. I'm actually a senior at Hunter College. I'm in the BSW program. And so what intrigued me to actually come today was when I saw the word Syria, because I'm actually Egyptian. And since I'm in the social work program, I am also very interested in justice and advocacy. And so I had a question for Ruham. So you were saying how like your experience in like just advocating for yourself. And so I was thinking in social work how we're also encouraging our clients to tell their stories. So what advice would you tell us in order to let others or like individuals or families to express their experiences, and especially in traumatic experiences?
Thank you for the question. It's definitely important question, but there is unfortunately no one answer for that, or no recipe to explain. It's very tough experience, I must say. It really takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of courage. It takes also it takes really it needs really a lot of power and commitment and dedication. It's also the most difficult about this decision also to participate in such trials is that you don't really know what are you going to get from this trial before you have gone through the whole experience from day one to the last day. So it is definitely tough, and I cannot really explain the difficulty of this, but I can only explain how rewarding that feeling is by the end of the day when you get the court itself to participate in the trial, to hear the verdict, to see also other people who have participated in this trial, and this for me was really rewarding, because when we because this is what we went out to the streets in 2011. This is what we wanted for Syria. We wanted justice, and we wanted rights, and we wanted freedom. So this is exactly one of the reasons why we went out to the streets. And now me also during the trial, I have heard also many names of people who participated in the trial as witnesses or as civil parties, that people I knew since Damascus, that people who were with me out in the streets, and who have participated also in the Syrian uprising. So it also felt like it's not only rewarding for me as an individual, but it's also rewarding that me and these few people have gathered again in 10 years in the court in Germany to sue one of the people responsible for torturing us. So this is something that is that we didn't, as I say, we didn't dream about before. I would say that this, if a person this person who wants to make this decision has to make sure that they have enough support around them to take part in such an experience, or people who are well informed about should be well informed about the whole process and what is going to take. For me, actually, to be honest, I didn't knew that it's gonna be so much difficult at the beginning. I didn't think that it's gonna also affect me for the whole the whole process. I thought like it's going to affect me the day of the trial, like when I go to the trial, the week around it. But no, it has affected my whole life since the last 2 years, and then this is something you really need to explain to the people, that this something will make you busy. Like even if you are not in the court, you are the whole time you are busy in your mind with the thoughts about the court and what's going to happen in the court. So this kind of information, I guess it's very important to share with anyone who is thinking about joining such efforts. So, but as I said, it's by the end of the day, it's really rewarding, and it's something that's worth all the efforts.
Thank you so much for sharing. As a future social worker, that really helps me in the field. And my second and last question was, when you're advocating, what supported you? Was it your community? Was it, or did you didn't find much support? Like, what support system or support institutes maybe, was there anything?
Well, support, I had several types of support. There was the most crucial and important and essential support is the support I have received from ECCHR, a legal entity that knows what is this whole thing about and explains to me all the steps that I have been taking through this court, and also offers me explanation for any question that arises. I mean, this is really essential to have this kind of technical support, to have these professional people behind you who can explain to you, and who can also stay focused for things that me as a normal person sometimes I would have missed or didn't take into consideration. So this is very essential, is to have the technical support. Also, another essential support is the emotional support. People who pass through such experience, they are mostly overloaded and overwhelmed with the whole process. So I tried my best to keep the right people around me, to inform my friends. I have informed my friends, for an example, for about important days at the court, and they have accompanied me for one day when I said my testimony. So this was also important support. So information is a key. Also, is to inform the person about as I said, the next steps and their rights and their opportunities and options. This is something very important for these people.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ruham. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, this is the final question. Okay, so we'll just take two questions together. Okay, this one's online, and then why don't you go ahead and come up and we'll take yours. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for your time and for being here. My name is Fatima. I'm a Cuny Law student and a Sorensen fellow. Often the conversations about accountability in Syria assume that this conflict is somehow ended, which we know is far from true. How do we demand accountability without enabling that sort of mischaracterization? Let's go ahead.
Thank you for being here, Ruham, and also thank you for the speakers. The first thing that I wanted to ask about is you began the talk about how the German prosecutors and in courts, the research or there was a decision about specifying torture. But we also know that Syria has experienced a large repertoire of political violence, including as one of the people who asked the question, sexual violence. We have demographic engineering, social engineering, large swaths of areas within Syria, specifically Sunni areas in Damascus countryside, are being bulldozed now, so that the government empties lands so that people who supported the government throughout the war are able to inhabit those areas, and people who left cannot return. So, and also most importantly, the use of chemical weapons. So all of those crimes amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, but we do not see the same sort of emphasis that we see with torture. So I'm curious about why is it that there was this decision. The other decision, or the other question that I had is that, you know, just thinking politically in terms of what this form of justice means to Syrians, one of the main differences between what's happening now in Syria and what happened in Nuremberg is that the regime still exists. When Nuremberg happened and Eichmann trials happened, the Nazi regime did not exist. So what does that mean in terms of the chilling effect that's happening in Syria? Does that mean that people who are involved in the regime are no longer going to be involved in it? Or does that mean that they're actually going to stop being involved in it? So that's also a political question that will affect the future of Syria and the future of Justice and Accountability Service in the country. Thanks
thank
again.
you very much.
Yeah.
All three questions are very much connected and all are dealing with politics. And so it's obviously not a pure legal question which is on stake. And to start with your question, that's what we have. I mean, Assad is still in power. He's still holding political prisoners in torture prisons. International community is more and more accepting him on the table. We are objecting it, but still it is like it is. But that doesn't prevent you from starting, you know, this long way to whatever is justice. And so what strikes me is that I feel a little bit Ruham, and there is also a colleague of hers, Masi. When we discuss about justice, we have more or less the same idea of this is obviously, it doesn't bring the Koblenz trial, or many Koblenz trial won't bring back all the death and this is not what we understand under absolute justice, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think with this more, let's say, pragmatic approach, you know, that this is something that can be done. It has a very important impact. You know, we start into something. We have no idea how it ends, but that's our story. I mean, that's our history. We don't know where all of this ends, and this goes also for the Syria trials. And obviously, you're right, and we could make up a list of many more crimes which go not only unpunished but also uninvestigated. But it was very clear for us as ECCHR and like-minded organization, but also together with the torture survivors and the lawyers and journalists, that torture actually, that's very interesting, because we have, when people talk about so-called international humanitarian law, you know, it's better to say the law of the war. It allows a lot too much. It allows a lot of attacks against civilian populations, which shouldn't be allowed. Whereas when it comes to torture, we have the absolute prohibition of torture. And so, and also we have our feeling is, and that is obviously a strategic decision, the prosecutors can deal easier with torture. And so this was our entry point. We don't know how far we get with this. Maybe others have already started to file other complaints, but that's how we knowing how incomplete this is how we started. And to the first question, I was saying this is a very that needs a whole more debate, and I'll invite you to have this debate in person at some point where I'm going to stay until the end of May as scholar in residence, and we have already foreseen with Camille that at some other point we will have a follow-up discussion in a smaller circle of the students in April or in May.
Yeah, just to add a few points. Fatima, to your question about the mischaracterization of the conflict as having ended, I think in part that's all. Wolfgang talked a little bit to the legal part. Let's also talk about the journalistic part. I mean, a lot of the framing of those narratives, that power lies with journalists and how we discuss what is happening in Syria. And you're absolutely correct. We have to sort of work somehow to rewire people's brains. You know, just as this idea that the violence has ended in Syria sort of misunderstands the nature of violence. It's the same sort of presumption upon which that Denmark is talking about sending Syrian refugees back to Syria. The violence has stopped. The violence that we can see has ended. And as you pointed out, beyond torture, the demographic reengineering and by moving entire populations, by taking over property, is part of that kind of invisible violence. It needs to be, we need to redefine how we understand what is violence. And that falls to in many ways, those of us who get to tell those narratives, whether it's in, as journalists or pop culture or as professors, as teachers. For me, a terrifying scene is when I see a scene from Damascus that is just a bunch of people hanging out at a cafe, and having a drink, because what violence had to be committed for that scene to be able to occur. And you are right, the regime has survived. Both of you are correct about that, and it has had a chilling effect. There were witnesses who did not testify. The Germans were unable to provide a kind of witness protection. So then the question becomes, as you all nod your heads in agreement with me that we should be doing this, who are we asking to bear the costs of speaking up against the regime? Now that the regime is feeling a little more comfortable, their surveillance activities, even in the diaspora, have gone up, and they are watching people, and they are reporting back about and Ruham can probably speak to that. But so I guess, question for us all to consider here is like, what can we do to what can we do to enable a situation where people can sort of still speak up against the regime, testify against the regime, tell different narratives about the regime? How do we enable that? And Ruham, I'm sure you probably have, this is
Yes.
what I'm constantly thinking about.
I really would like to add one very important point here. Maybe this is the exact reason why Koblenz and similar efforts are essential, is because the regime is still alive, and because the governments, many governments in the world, are considering normalizing the regime and rehabilitating the regime. This is why to have a court that says that this regime is a torture regime is something very important for us as activists against this regime at this stage, is to vocalize how this regime cannot run away with such crimes, and anyone who normalizes the relationship with the Assad dictatorship regime is actually putting hands in the hands of a total and a criminal regime. So this is why we should also encourage other steps. Of course, Koblenz is not the justice itself for Syria, and Koblenz won't bring my friends who have passed away in the same branch. I have friends who passed away in the same branch, and this trial didn't bring them back, and will never do. But what this trial is important for is that to tell the whole world what kind of regime we are talking about here. And this is something also we have been trying to explain to the world since 2011, since we have went out to the streets. We are trying to tell the world in a way or another that this regime is this dictatorship regime is a criminal regime. And now we have a European court that says that, and that has proven that, and that has also used many testimonies and stories and also evidences were recognized in this trial. So this is where I found it important, and justice has to start before the regime falls down, because we also, because if we let the regime run away with these crimes just because they are still in power, these crimes will be one day forgotten. And the regime is now, because nobody is talking about the chemical weapons in Al-Ghouta, the regime now is digging out the graves of people who died from the chemical attacks and trying to demolish and wipe away all the evidences of these attacks. And this is why we need to highlight all these crimes, even if the regime is not down yet.
So true. On that note, on behalf of the Craig Newmark Cuny School of Journalism and Cuny School of Law and the Sorensen Center, the Goethe Institute, we want to thank everyone who joined in the room and on Zoom, and especially Ruham. Thank you. And thank you, Alia and Wolfgang.
Thanks for the invitation.
For this informative and moving conversation, important conversation this evening, and especially just for what you all do in this world, and to educate future journalists, human rights lawyers, activists. There's so much talent in the room and so many amazing people. I hope that those of you who are here in person will join us for a reception. Jorg and I invite you, and thank you again for coming. One more round of applause for our panelists.